Hello, welcome to episode 42 of Women of the Future. Today we will be looking at the subject of women's rights. It's something that you've obviously heard before, but today we will be listening to Sister Denise, who will enlighten us on the subject from a spiritual perspective. Sister Denise, I bid you welcome.
Thank you.
Women's rights. There's scarcely a woman on the planet who hasn't heard of this. But the angle that I would like to take on the subject, Sister Denise, is from a very personal perspective rather than looking at it globally. How does a woman ensure that her own rights are upheld? Where does it start?
I think it's very important for a woman to really know her rights. And I personally am very much in favor of encouraging women to actually read the Declaration of Human Rights, because it's been very beautifully designed and written by Eleanor Roosevelt, who is a woman herself, and that was in the 1930s. And the 1930s was a time socially when pretty much across the globe women had hardly any rights. And so for her to write that down and describe these things was very interesting. And now, nearly 100 years later, most women still don't enjoy much in the way of those rights. For example, the right to education is very important, because if you don't know to read and write, then you can't get access to information. I think that a woman's right over her body is very important, because otherwise in most patriarchal societies, a woman has no right to decide how much sleep she has to have, what food she has, how much food she has, whether or not she has a child, whether or not she has to lose that child through forced abortion or through infanticide, which is done by very often the mother-in-law, who's also a woman, but part of that patriarchy, you see. A woman's right to privacy is very important. A woman's right to her opinions. There are so many different levels, and the messages that many women get are that you're not that different from an animal, and therefore we do with you what we want.
Ouch, that's very painful.
Very painful.
There are a number of women watching you right now who feels in her heart that her dignity is being continually compromised because she's not given the regard that she feels she deserves. How does she go about redressing this? That's the issue, isn't it? How do you put it right?
Well, it is the issue on one level, but on another level, the woman doesn't really have clarity about what her rights are and about what her dignity is, because what she will feel from the inside and what messages she will receive from the outside conflict. And so that will cause her to doubt whether or not she has any right to any dignity. But there's one very beautiful song, I think, Aretha Franklin, about dignity, which women should definitely listen to.
I'm not sure if I've heard that one, but
I'll show it to you. But no, a person's, we're talking about human dignity. So rights and human dignity do go together, and when a woman enjoys her personhood, and that if she has or that she must set boundaries and those boundaries will not be crossed, then she definitely begins to get a sense of her rights and her dignity and her place within the family, the community, and the world.
Now, Sister Denise, it is a given that we cannot change other people. We can only change ourselves. Is it?
Well, definitely you can't change other people. You can lead a horse to water, you can't make him drink. That's a well-known saying. And a lot of people, including many women, keep trying to change their husbands, change their mother-in-law or whatever. But, you know, you really only have jurisdiction over yourself. But if you don't know what your rights are, you can't set about feeling them and asserting them and establishing them. Because you see, if a woman knows her value and she can convey that, you know, in many ways you decide how you're going to be treated. You communicate to others, this is how you talk to me, this is how you treat me. And if you learn how to do that, that is going to make a difference.
That sounds very beautiful when you put it that way. But my question is, how does a woman implement this? How does she make it real for herself, where she is not absorbing the negative messages that are coming to her continually from the outside?
Well, if you don't have something going on the inside, the outside messages have nothing to prevent them going in. But where you have a lot going on the inside, the outside messages stop at the gate of your boundaries.
Okay. Does this mean that a woman should change her self-talk? What changes are we talking about?
Self-talk, yes. How I, a woman, think about myself. And, you know, the difficulty, the obstacle is women are isolated, which we mentioned before. Women are kept within the four walls, but, you know, as long as you can acquire some technical skills, some basic education, it is going to enable you to have access to information. And if you have access to information, you can start thinking about it. It's when you are denied access to information that you have no recourse against all these messages. But I think nowadays things are shifting in that area, and women are, just because of the nature of the way the world is, it's just more difficult to prevent women from knowing.
Yeah. Okay, Sister Denise, what you are saying has indeed global significance, but what is of concern to a woman watching you right now who feels betrayed by her family, by her community, by her country? Tell us what she stands to do.
Let us look not just only at the lowest level of women who are in trouble, because we've done that a great deal. But there are women who are well educated, who have position in the community, who have their profession, and let's see how women's rights operates there also, because I think that a lot of the people who are at the lowest end of the social spectrum are not going to be looking at this program. It's really people higher up who are going to be more the demographic group that we're speaking to. So it needs to be relevant to those women. And you know, what happens is that there is a sort of set of double standards that go on in the workplace, in the home, where some of the archaic attitudes still bleed through in a much more modern setting, in a much more educated setting. And you do get examples of women who are really badly treated in spite of their education, in spite of their professional position, in spite of their self-empowerment, you see. And this is really a strange phenomenon that I have observed. And I think we do need to also address this, because it's quite a big thing. And in a way, there's no reason why it has to be there. So what would be the reason is that the woman, maybe who is verbally abused or ill-treated by the males, even in spite of her education and her position. It's like there's a stigma, a social stigma that she's dealing with. She's still dealing with some of these archaic situations. And even though we say, well, as long as you're educated and as long as you can make your own money, you should be okay, but yet we find you're not okay, even in spite of that. So there may be some other thing, some other powerful energy that has to be added to the ingredients to make it possible for a woman to really enjoy her rights.
And what is that powerful ingredient? Where does it come from? Who does it come from?
Well, perhaps this is where the spiritual end can be helpful, because you see, if a woman is has all the things, the external things, but maybe is internally still doubting her value, I think, again, it has to do with women supporting each other, as well as women really claiming the right to developing themselves spiritually. And, you know, a spiritually empowered woman historically has been considered, you know, very dangerous.
Why?
Well, if you think of in historical times, women who have great spiritual power, they are considered, you know, sorceress or witch, wizard, you know, something that is sort of bad, because you see, the patriarchal world has also taken over the spiritual dimension by having claimed all the rights to the religious powers. And what I feel is that religious powers and spiritual powers are not the same, but in the patriarchal religious world, they are the same. So if a woman becomes spiritually powerful, then the patriarchal religious domain of the male will see that as a threat and an enemy, and will do a great deal to prevent a woman from gaining her spiritual power, because if a woman is in her power, in her spiritual power, there's basically nothing you can do against her. So in a sense it's the last bastion, you know, once education has been claimed, the capacity and right to make money has been claimed, but then the spiritual power, that's a big one.
Many years ago I read this article which was of interest to me because it was written in the country from which I emanate, where it said that a number of women got together, they all held positions of authority, either CEO, CFO, MD in their various companies. But the one fear that all of them had is that somebody someday, usually a male counterpart, will walk into their office and say to them, I know that you are a fraud. I see right through you. Yeah, and that hit home for me. Because, well, I was climbing the ladder at the time, and I felt sad on their behalf, because these were highly educated, highly competent women, and their only question against themselves, their only doubt, their only problem, as it were, which is not actually a problem, is that they were females.
Yes.
Which is so bizarre. But their fear was legitimate. It wasn't just words. It was a real fear. And when I read that, I thought, how sad, how very sad.
I think it's connected with the idea that a woman should not be able to be competent. Therefore, if she presents herself as competent, is fake. An illogical set of syllogisms that go on in the mind of the patriarchy. And, that message is still fed to the woman while she's getting educated and while she's earning her money and while she's enjoying all the fruits. The same thing exists in men, and it exists in men who have been abused. So what happens when a person has been abused on any level, It's a kind of legacy of abuse, because you have to do so much to compensate for that, to build yourself up. There's always this deep, deep feeling inside that it's not real, because it has to be constructed. Now, when you're building...
I'm sorry, what has to be constructed?
What has to be constructed is their persona, their image, and all of that, you see. And they get left after abuse with this feeling that somebody's going to find out I'm a fraud. It's much more prominent in women because they get much more abused, but it's also there in men. I've seen it in men, and it will dog the professional person all the way through. One of these days, someone's going to find out that I'm a fraud. They're not a fraud, but there is a feeling, and it's some sort of a psychological issue, but it's related, you know. And so when there is abuse of a person, woman or man, the psychological consequences are vast and undefined, and they need to be defined, because otherwise people make an assumption that if you feel like a fraud, it's because you are a fraud.
Yeah.
You know, but actually you feel like a fraud because you've had to deal with so much opposition that you've had to construct this protective maybe shield or a persona that is actually you're right, but you know, a person who hasn't been abused, who has been supported in their professional development, they construct it, but they're not constructing it as a protection. They're just constructing it as a normal building, you know.
A veneer.
A veneer is really fake,
Okay.
you see. So you're constructing a solid thing, and people are telling you it's a veneer. It's not a veneer, it's solid.
Okay.
But because of the history of abuse, you don't think it's real. You think it is a veneer. It's not a veneer. You're unable to distinguish between the real thing and a piece of plastic.
Sister Denise, the other thing that comes to mind is an expression I read not too long ago, which says that one of the quirks of life is that an intelligent person will always doubt his or her capacity, intellectual prowess, whereas somebody who's lacking in intellectual skills will actually overestimate themselves.
Well, that happens very often, but I wouldn't call it a rule.
Okay. Yeah, but I just found that interesting. The one message that is sent to women in the corporate sector, that a number of women earn less than their male counterparts of the same level as far as their work position is concerned.
So this is something that we're finding a lot in the question of governance and so on, where women are working hard to achieve equal pay for equal work, equal pay for equal position. But you see, there's such a deep feeling, which is coming from the archaic attitudes, that a woman doesn't need that much money, and therefore she shouldn't get it.
That may have been the case in the previous century, but certainly not now.
I don't think even in the previous century. The woman, you know, needs money, and what you work for, you have a right to. And if the patriarchal world says, well, you know, and look at some of the salaries and bonuses that are enjoyed by men, where you have a vast disparity between a few who earn in the billions and the enormous number of people who have to deal with just pennies, you see. And one of the things about women as they get to the top level in the corporate world is they look and see that this is a horrible arena and they back off. That means there's something that's happened at this extreme of the disparity which the women just cannot go for, but which the men are willing to go for. And this is where I think that the feminine ethos is very important, because I think that it is the one thing that's capable of bringing humanity back from this brink that they're standing on to go into something really catastrophic, you see. Because in terms of the polarities between the wealthy and the poor, men and women, whatever, all these different polarities, once you get to a certain extreme, it collapses and resets itself in its original condition. And I think we're just so close there to that, which is a very dangerous place to be. And I think that the feminine energy, or the female mentality, however you want to put it, has in itself the capacity to sort of bring it back.
In what way? And how?
Because the woman won't go past a certain point, a man will. Of extreme.
That's a bit cryptic. Could you clarify?
When you get to the top of the corporate level, what you have to do in order to take that much salary is so immoral and so contrary to the principles of spirituality. But a man who's doing that obviously doesn't feel it that way, whereas a woman who goes over there really feels it. She won't do it.
Okay, so thank you. I think this brings us to almost the end of our session today. There are women watching you right now, Sister Denise, who feel compromised, who feel that they're hard done by, who feel that all is not well. But they want to do not just everything, but just one thing, one step at a time, to improve, to change, to make the shift. What would be your message to her? Spiritual study and spiritual practice, because this is what gives you power. And if you are weakened or weak or weakened, then the thing you need is inner power. And that's the first thing to work with. I asked you this before, but I think it fits in this context. Define spirituality, as you just put it. It's a very broad term, and it's bandied about a lot. So I want to know what you mean practically by that. Well, spiritual power is an energy that comes from outside the world, which gives you the ability to do what you decide to do. And lack of spirituality is where you want to do something, but you somehow can't. So that is why I call it power, to actually be able to do what you want to do. And this energy comes from the Supreme Being. Usually in the world we live in, people work with physical energy. The energy of money, the energy of matter, the energy of the intellect, all these things, the worldly things. This is coming from a totally different source, and it is the soul itself that absorbs it and then uses it in the context of daily life, from the simplest to the most complex levels. Okay, thank you. There you go, women's rights. Sister Denise has taken it from the perspective of women who have to some extent stepped into their own power, but yet there are many of you on the planet, many of us on the planet, who feel that there's something that we can change, something that we can do so that our voices are heard, so that we feel acknowledged being in a female body. Sister Denise has shared her ideas on what this means. She brought in the spiritual element to show the viewer how one can use spirituality as a tool in this context, and I do hope and trust that you will try it and see if it works for you. Thanks so much for joining us this half hour, and we will see you soon. Take care. Cheers.